going back to the original problem, a patient with emphysema who's not exhaling enough CO2 drops their blood pH below 7.35. Do you diagnose this problem as respiratory alk or respiratory acidosis? Respiratory acidosis. Why is it a respiratory issue?
Carbon dioxide.
Yes, carbon dioxide can't be exhaled, so this is a breathing disorder, right? So because this person can't breathe off the excess CO2, that's the problem. That's what's causing the imbalance. Yeah.
Why are we reabsorbing the H?
Because this can act, you remember we talked about this can act as a base sometimes as an acid. This time it's acting as a base. And if you're currently in acidosis, this will bring base back into your bloodstream. The compensation for a respiratory acidosis problem is metabolic. There you go. Okay, so compensation just generally is metabolic alkalosis. But that may not necessarily tell you what's happening in the person. This specific compensation here is what's happening. Test the urine and see that that person is excreting more hydrogen ions. The blood should be made more alkaline by the retention of bicarbonate. Here's something to think about. How do you retain bicarbonate? How do you reabsorb it?
You don't?
You couple it with sodium, exactly. Do you see the link? There's the link. Because sodium bicarbonate, we just mentioned, acts as a base, right? So if you couple bicarbonate reabsorption with sodium, there's your base that you're bringing back in. What hormone retains sodium?
Aldosterone.
Lo and behold, acid-base balance is relying on aldosterone. So this is an aldosterone-driven process. We should just call Bio 211 the aldosterone course, because that's all we talk about in here.
Don't forget ADH.
What's that?
NADH.
NADH, yeah. You can just call this the hormonal course. Are you with me so far? How about questions so far?
The pH is too high. It means you have to get rid of the hydrogen. You're going to secrete those in the DCT. They're going to go out in the urine. You're going to reabsorb the bicarbonate because it helps with the capturing of the hydrogen ions. And you're going to reabsorb that with the sodium. Does it follow the sodium or does it take a chemical change and come that?
It's a coupling mechanism. It's like what they call secondary transport.
Okay.
So it just comes with the sodium back in. But if your pH is too high, we're going to flip this whole scenario.
The pH is too high?
Yeah, because that's what you started with pH was too high, right?
Mm-hmm. You
Yeah.
secrete the hydrogen. Okay.
Let's flip the scenario. Let's say that you've got a person who, okay, this was me about a year ago. I cut my finger off cutting a frozen chicken apart, and I'm driving to the urgent care to get stitches in my finger because the knife slipped and cut my finger open. Hyperventilating, okay? So what does that do to your blood pH?
Alkaline.
Alkaline. Good. So let's say that you've got a person who's in respiratory alkalosis. Okay, so we've got a pH here that's above 7.45.
We want to decrease the pH.
Good. The compensation is to decrease the pH, and how we do it, it's not by the respiratory system.
Metabolic.
Metabolic is the fix, right? Keep track of your errors. This can be the biggest help to you in figuring out what's happening, because if our goal is to decrease the pH, and we're looking at a metabolic compensation, what we do then is now decrease hydrogen secretion, because what am I doing if I'm hyperventilating? You're releasing CO2, and if you release CO2, you're ultimately getting too much of this out of your bloodstream. Too much hydrogen is being removed, because if you remove the carbon dioxide, there's just less of this in general, right? So you can tell the excited, anxious person to slow down and breathe correctly. That's easy enough to say, right? But if they can't control their breathing, then you've got to have a renal compensation that will take over for you. So what does not allowing so many hydrogen ions out in urine do for your pH? Lowers your pH. So if you're something like 7.6, the more hydrogens you keep, the more acid your blood becomes, which is what you want to do right now. But what you also want to do is decrease bicarbonate absorption. You might recall bicarb is filtered at the glomerulus. It travels through PCT. If aldosterone is present, sodium is reabsorbed, bicarbonate is reabsorbed, chlorine is reabsorbed, water. But if aldosterone is not present, then we let go of that bicarbonate and sodium. So it's a way to actually dump off and get rid of that extra bicarbonate if your bloodstream is too alkaline, because that bicarb is acting as a base. So dump it and get rid of it. So what's the general type of compensation that we're talking about right now? Metabolic acidosis. Good.
You said that's the respiratory alkalosis?
Yeah, if the problem for this person here is respiratory out, then you're right, compensation is metabolic acidosis. So
the metabolic compensation is always the opposite of respiratory problem?
Right.
If you have respiratory alkalosis, is metabolic acidosis?
Always.
Okay.
Yeah.
And your,
I'm sorry.
so, for these situations, below, if you have something below, you want to increase.
Right.
If you have something above, you want to decrease.
Right. Let's do the opposite problem, because you can have metabolic issues that promote respiratory compensation. There's lots of things that can go wrong metabolically. Everything from diabetes, hormone imbalances, even electrolyte imbalances. Sodium and potassium levels can ultimately alter bicarbonate levels in the bloodstream. And you can see that's all aldosterone regulated. So let's say that you've got somebody with metabolic acidosis, they're diabetic, they're breaking fats down into sugars for their body to operate. So let's say that they cannot excrete the proper ions to keep their pH balanced. So let's take a look at that problem. So we've got somebody who's below 7.35. Their kidneys are not able to handle whatever is going on metabolically. So if you've got a person in ketoacidosis, this could create a situation of metabolic acidosis. The way to compensate for this pH change in the bloodstream is through changing this reaction back and forth. Now notice the arrows from here go both ways. So if you've got too much acid in the bloodstream, we can shift this reaction this way. So what can you do with excess CO2?
Breathe it out.
Breathe it out, exactly. The compensation is going to be the opposite system and the opposite pH. So if your problem is metabolic acidosis, the compensation is respiratory alkalosis. Okay? But you don't walk into somebody's room and say, oh, they're in respiratory alkalosis. You walk into their room and say, I got a patient who's breathing really fast, right? I got somebody who's hyperventilating. So in this case, we want to increase the pH, right? Watch the arrows. If you increase the pH, you're going to increase the breathing rate, what you call fast breathing.
Hyperventilation.
There you go. How does hyperventilation help this problem?
Brings oxygen balance.